I love what I do. I love the creativity. I love taking something raw, like a bunch of rhubarb, and turning it into something incredible where people are like, oh my God, wow, from, a few basic ingredients. And it is really something magical to be able to do that in life and to feed people.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. There are many cuisines with an array of ingredients, techniques, traditions, and nuances, and many types of chefs, but few require the extreme precision and exacting measures of pastry. The art of pastry is as much about the result as it is the science behind it. But what makes great pastry? Tiffany Jones is the owner and head of pastry at Tiffany Etc. Tiffany, how are you?
Good, thank you. Huck, yourself?
Good. It's good to get you on the show. How are things travelling at the moment?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been a pretty relaxed year for me after we lost the business last year after COVID. So I decided to take a bit more of a step back and really just focus on creative process and doing things that I enjoy. So I've been doing a lot of chocolate work this year, which is great. We're focusing a bit more on celebration cakes, big wedding cakes, and the artistic side of it.
Take us through that sort of process. You mentioned you lost the business last year. What sort of impact did that have on you, and has the time allowed you to think a bit differently?
Yeah, my mindset has definitely changed, but it has taken, it's been a long healing process. I won't lie. It was pretty brutal. I've had a very long career, 30 years in the industry, so I was definitely no newbie to sort of opening restaurants and things like that. And I really thought that we were ready for it when we did sort of step in and sign that lease. So we ended up signing. We got the property end of 2019 and we signed early 2020 because I waited for a few months to make sure that, the COVID wave had completely died off from the first lockdown. And we were pretty confident. We're like, it seems good. Everything's gone back to normal. This was sort of February 2020. So I took the leap and we threw everything we had at it to sort of open our own space, and it was a sort of dessert wine bar. We did coffee in the mornings and pastries all day, and then at night we did some really awesome bar snacks and had a great little wine list and some incredible plated desserts. So it really was a cross between a pastry shop and a restaurant, which is what I always wanted. We were based in Rosebery, and great local following. Even during the lockdown, we opened, back to the opening. We opened June 2020, and the opening collided with our wedding, which was pretty hectic, as you can imagine. The build ran late. Most restaurant builds do. I don't know one that's ever been on time in my whole career. So we ended up opening about the 7th of June, and then we got locked down on the 22nd of June. So that was not even, 2 weeks trading as a proper business. So it was a bit of an eye-opener. It was a bit of a shock. We had, we sort of opened with working capital and this great business plan, and I pretty much just tore it up and threw it out the window when the lockdown happened, and we just had to pivot. We started doing, cocktails in jars and takeaway cheese boards and charcuterie and cakes and, dropping things on people's doorsteps and anything we could to try and keep staff on and stay open. And I literally poured everything I had into keeping all my full-time staff. I didn't stand any of my full-timers down. So it was really interesting because it really showed me what I was made of. I think a bit of insanity, a little bit of craziness, definitely pushing through it all. So we got to the end of that lockdown, and I think the restrictions lifted sort of October, November, and we were so busy, Huck, it was amazing. It was exactly like I wanted it to be. We were booked out every weekend. People couldn't get a table for 6 weeks, and, things were really taking off. And at the time, the business was called The Pastry Project, which was my long-standing brand. And we just couldn't believe it. Me and my husband were gobsmacked. We're like, oh, maybe we're going to recover, from everything, all the money we've lost in the last 6 months. So we pushed on, and we had, things were going great guns. Had bookings for December all the way up to, New Year's Eve. And then Omicron came upon us, and that would have been about the second week of December. And I literally watched $20,000 worth of bookings and work fall off a cliff overnight. And I just said to my husband, I said, I don't know what we're going to do. And at the time we were battling with Services New South Wales. Because we were a new business, we didn't get any support from the government at that stage. So we were sort of going back and forth with them, trying to figure out if they could help us at all. And then we got to the end of December, and I made the very hard decision. I had to stand down my head chef and then go back into the kitchen full time and, take myself away from running the business. Which was fine. Like I'm not afraid of hard work. So I sort of stepped in and we did that. And my poor husband then stepped out and took a job to sort of help support the business, and then come in at night being the barman. And this is a guy that was an electrician, Huck. So he went from being an electrician to a barman. He knows how to make gelato and he can whip up a cake. So he's pretty multitasking these days. So for him, it was a really big shock because, when we'd been together for 3 or 4 years before we got married, and we were both a bit older, we're in our late 40s. And when he met me, he thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to marry a chef. This is amazing, And little did he know that chef would be chained to her business 100 hours a week. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire for our very early marriage. And we, it took its toll. We nearly went our separate ways after, losing the business. It was really, really tough. So we struggled through Omicron. We, again, fought to get any assistance. We finally got some assistance in June last year. So everything's over. The pandemic's pretty much finished. And then finally the government gave us some wage assistance from early in the year. But by that stage, we'd just taken on far too much debt, and it was taking its toll on me. And then the staff shortages kicked in as well. So from about February that year, we just struggled. We couldn't have a full roster. I don't know what it was. I think everyone was in the same boat at the time. Like, everyone was just screaming out for staff. And I took on a lot of juniors, which was fine because I've trained a lot of chefs in my day. But, obviously taking on those juniors takes me away from, doing what else I've got to do. But, we managed for a while, and then sort of May, June, it started to pick up again. But, yeah, we were just drowning, and I had to make the call to, become insolvent. And we did that, and then the landlords, we tried to renegotiate the lease, and we didn't owe the landlords any money. It was really, when I say we owed people money, it was like the tax office and places like that. So we tried to make good with all of our suppliers. I'm still paying some of them off, trying to do the right thing, and we. It was really just the business loan and the tax office and places like that took the hit. But we tried to renegotiate with the landlord because he put the property up for sale amongst all of this. So, and this is after we'd spent $100,000 on a fit out. And we then were going back and forth. Our lawyers were going back and forth. And we didn't owe them a cent. We were paid up with our rent. Everything was up to date. Nothing ominous there with the landlord. But then he decided that when he found a buyer, the buyer wanted it vacant possession. So we then had 30 days to get out.
How did it make you feel when you sort of had to make that call and let go of everything that you'd built?
Yeah, I wanted to die. I was absolutely distraught. It really destroyed me. It not just destroyed me as a person, as a business person, as a chef. It really knocks your confidence when you think after 30 years you can finally do this, and then you fail, and it's taken a lot of therapy and a lot of support from my family and my husband's family and friends to get me through this. And, I was so lucky, Huck. I got amazing calls of support from, Colin Fasnich and James Metcalf and all these other people, that have known me over the years that I've worked with, saying, Tiff, it's not the end. You just have to, just get through this and you're going to be okay. And it's taken a lot of convincing to be okay. So, I decided end of December, I kept the business running from a temporary kitchen, which is really difficult. And by the end of December, I just decided to stand down any staff that I had left, and I completely closed the pastry project. I just ripped the Band-Aid off and I went, right, I'm done. I can't keep. I felt like I was flogging a dead horse. I mean, we were still very busy up to the end of the year, and I filled all the orders that we had. Our Christmas range went great. We, mailed it all over Australia, and the orders were coming in thick and fast for Christmas, which was fantastic. But I was so burnt out. Like I didn't really stop. I went from the shop, moving the kitchen to keep the business going. And then come December, that was it. We closed it up. I packed the van up and we went down to Adelaide to see my parents. And I literally, I think I slept for about 4 days. And my mum's like, what's wrong with you? I'm like, I'm just so exhausted. And then it took me 3 weeks of, just hanging out with my parents to try and unwind and start unpacking everything. And it's probably taken me a good 6 months. The first 6 months of this year, I've spent unpacking everything that happened and, the decisions that I'd made and, everything that we got through. And, me and my husband are stronger than ever. And like I said to him, our second anniversary was very recently, it was only last month. And I said, if we've got through the last 2 years, we can get through anything.
You mentioned how much you've changed coming out of this. If you reflect back to that time and the incredible challenges that you faced, what are some of the positives that you've pulled out of that as you've moved forward?
I've always thought of myself as a pretty strong person, Huck, and I realise now that I am very, very resilient. And in the words of my big brother, I can't say it on radio because he swears a bit, but he calls me a very, very persistent, tenacious MF, he calls me. And this is a guy who's very high functioning as well. So he just said, your tenacity at just trying to keep it going, and even now trying to rebuild. He said, I take my hat off to you. He said, because most people would have laid down and given up. So, I have come to realise that I am very tenacious, and I do have a lot of, interpersonal and mental strengths. But it even broke me, and I feel like I'm probably one of the stronger people that I know. But it has also taught me to learn to let go, and that the bricks and mortar, even though we did so much building ourselves and, the painting and the tiling and all the things that we did, we put so much of our heart and soul into it. I had to let it go, and it wasn't meant to be. And until you let it go, nothing else opens up. I had to learn to process and unpack these things rather than just pushing them aside and going, I'll just keep working and I'll keep busy and I'll be okay. I actually had to stop. And it wasn't until I stopped that I realised, the impact that it had on my health, my mental health, and my family. Yeah.
Well, I want to explore in greater detail sort of what you are doing this year and what the year has for you for the rest of the year. But your career has been pretty extraordinary. We might need 3 episodes to go through it all.
It's pretty colourful.
Take us back to when you were young. What sort of role did food play in your family growing up?
So my parents were dairy farmers, Huck. So I grew up on dairy farms. And loved it, absolutely, loved it. Although at the time I couldn't see it. As a kid, I'd go to school and everyone else had, Tim Tams and packets of chips, and I had home-baked chocolate cake and homemade cookies and, a bottle of milk. And I'd just be like, I'd be trading people, for my mum's baked goods. And at the time, I sort of didn't realise. When I look back, I realised, just how lucky we were to have so much home-cooked food, and very, quite Australian. It was rural sort of Australia where we were dairy farming, and my parents are both. So one side is sort of Welsh, so that English sort of style of cooking, and actually. So my mum's side one side of my family is Ukrainian, but that sort of the Ukrainian food didn't really come through till I was sort of a late teenager. I didn't really start appreciating that until then. But Yeah, so a lot of meat and three veg and stuff like that. And my dad was actually a cook in the army. Back in the day, yeah. So he cooked for the Queen at Duntroon during his training, and then after he got out of the army after Vietnam, and then became a dairy farmer. I'm not sure why, and decided to have 6 kids and that sort of life. But it really was a very interesting grounding. Learning about animals and eating off the land, and everything from raiding mum's passion fruit vine, which then became a dessert later on, to just drinking copious amounts of milk. My mum used to always joke, like, you're gonna have to drink water one day because it's not always going to be milk on tap. So litres and litres of milk a day, and just watching my parents cook and struggle, and we weren't we were very poor, so nothing sort of went to waste. And growing up in a family of 6 children as well, if you didn't eat your food, somebody else did. Like, it was, I don't know how my mum did it. It must have been like feeding time at the zoo with all 6 of us. And, if one of us didn't like peas, well, one of us had swapped the peas for pumpkin or something. So, there was always empty plates. There was never food left over at the end of a meal. So, but, it was an amazing grounding when I look back, and it does make me appreciate, producers and growing. And, it's something in my future. With me and my husband have got this 5-year plan of eventually buying a property down south, back down to South Australia, and making it a producing property, whether it's an orchard and getting into the dried fruit or a vineyard. I'm actually toying with the idea of a vineyard, and to have that Airbnb and grow things, and just really get back to the land as we get a bit older. That's a much later chapter.
Well, it sounds extraordinary.
Yeah.
When did you first sort of get an inkling that chefing was for you, and where did it start?
Oh, I don't know. So, I mean, there's a lot of kind of food aha moments when I was younger. One of them is mushrooms. I can't cook a mushroom without thinking of my dad, because we used to harvest them. They were all over the farm, and mostly the big field mushrooms, because of all the cow manure. So we'd trek out and we'd pick some massive mushrooms, and I must have been about 7 or 8 years old. And I remember getting back to the kitchen, and Dad goes, "Right, I'm going to teach you how to cook a mushroom." I was like, okay, great. So we got the big black pan out, and, we made sure we had some butter there, salt, pepper, and I think we had parsley, which was a bit exotic for us because my parents weren't big users of herbs. And we had good old white bread toast just to make it all romantic. We chopped them up, and my dad was saying to me, put the mushrooms in the pan and don't move them. And I was like, oh, okay. He goes, you don't want to hear them squealing. You know how they squeak when you put them in the pan. So I'm there as a kid, like, listening to make sure they weren't squealing because I wasn't moving them too much. And then, we turned them all over, and then we put some butter in. And little did I know, Dad goes, you've got to wait for the butter to bubble. And years later as a chef, I'd learned that this is foaming butter, right? This is, the cornerstone of how you cook with butter when you're caramelizing things. And we let the foaming butter go, and let them get a little bit of colour, and then in goes the salt, pepper, parsley onto the toast, and that was it. And I'll never forget it. For as long as I live, that's my first memory. And every time I eat a mushroom, I'm taken back, to that farm kitchen with my dad, and that absolutely amazing moment where I was just like, wow, you can take something from the land and you can turn it into something awesome on a plate. And I think that's one of my earliest memories of sort of thinking, I could probably do this for a living. But years later, when I left home, when I say years later, I left home when I was 16. Like a lot of people of our generation, we were kind of itching to get out in the world and do our thing. And my parents had relocated back to Adelaide, but I'd been going to high school in Tamworth because they've got off the farm, and Dad had been working as a rep. So I moved back to Tamworth, much to my parents' disgust, in with a house full of my friends and my boyfriend at the time. And I had to work because my parents were poor. They weren't going to support me at the time. So I saved up. I had $200 in my pocket in my suitcase, and that was it. I moved out of home. And I moved back to Tamworth, and I took on 3 jobs, and one of them was working in the deli at Woolworths, which back then was probably a bit more exotic than what it is now, I think. And I started working for this other lady in this little tiny place called Quick and Delicious, and it was a tiny little delicatessen kind of sandwich shop, and we did everything from scratch. Like we cooked our own chickens for the roast, roast rolls. We did legs of lamb. We did everything. We sliced it all up, and this was back in, this was 30 years ago, Huck. So it was this lady was ahead of her time, doing all these gourmet sandwiches. And we used to do a bit of catering for offices. And I remember once she let me do the platters, and I was just like, I must have been 16, and I was presenting this platter and I was laying everything out and I was designing it all in my little brain, just going, wow, this is amazing. And the creative side of me really started to come out. And she looked at it, she's like, wow, you're really good at this. And I was like, oh. And I thought, oh, maybe I can sort of do this cooking thing. And anyway, fast forward a couple of years, and I ended up, I split up with my boyfriend, and I said to Mum, I'm coming home, back to Adelaide. And she goes, okay, that's great. And she goes, what are you going to do? Because you can't move home, you need to get a job. And I was like, oh, okay. And my parents lived about an hour out of Adelaide, so they were still living on a homestead at that stage, even though they were both sort of working professionally in other jobs. So we still sort of had a farm, but we were subleasing most of the farm, and Mum and Dad lived on the homestead. So she's basically like, you can't come home. Like, I don't want to deal with you at home, so you need to get a job. So we put in for some TAFE courses, and I applied to be, you're going to laugh, it makes me laugh even to this day, an air hostess, like a front of house hospitality management, or a chef. So I put in for the 3 courses at TAFE, and I got accepted into all 3 of them, and I had to make the decision. And Mum's like, what do you really love doing? And I'm like, well, I like cooking. She's like, well, there's your answer. So I went and I did my pre-voc at TAFE, at Adelaide TAFE actually. And so the pre-voc was kind of like the first 6 months of your apprenticeship training. And then you go out and you apply for an apprenticeship, and it takes a bit of time off your apprenticeship. So at the end of my 6 months, when I went to go, I did some interesting industry placement actually with Tony Cathreptis, who was Lou Cathreptis' brother. So you would have heard of Lou over the years. He had Mazez, which was a very famous restaurant in Adelaide. And then I think he's still over in the UAE now. But I was very dear friends with Lou sort of back in the day, and started working in a kitchen for his brother Tony, which was across the road from Mazez. So that was my first introduction to a professional kitchen, and come hell or high water, I was going to prove myself. And I think this was a good grounding growing up with 4 brothers and stepping into a male-dominated field. I was just like, well, I've got 4 brothers. If I can compete against them, I can compete against you guys. So I was very, very determined, Huck, to make it into the industry and get my apprenticeship. And then when the roll call came up to apply for apprenticeships, I put myself forward, and I actually did my trial for my apprenticeship at Rigoni's down in Adelaide. At the time, Eugene Miali was the head chef at Rigoni's. So me and Eugene go way back. So Eugene's responsible for all of this chaos, Huck, all of it. It's all Eugene. He started it all. I hope he hears this. So Eugene was just so great to work with, and he was really lovely in the kitchen. I did a trial, and then I went back and did a couple more days, and then eventually they told me that I was the one that got the apprenticeship. And at the time, I don't know, 20, 30 kids must have applied, and Australia was coming out of a recession, so to get an apprenticeship was a big deal. To have a trade was a really important thing back then if you weren't going to go to uni. So I was stoked, and I got this apprenticeship, and then I got shipped off over to Grimaldi's, which was the sister restaurant, to work under a very tough English head chef, which was interesting because it was a bit of a baptism of fire, and that grounding of having 4 brothers definitely came to be one of my tools, because I was in a very, very male-dominated kitchen there, and I really had to prove my worth. And after 2 years, I moved on. I went to a little Greek restaurant, and then after that, oh gosh, I can't even remember where was next. I did do a brief stint in Sydney, actually. I finished my apprenticeship. I remember the last day of TAFE, and I walked out of TAFE, and Luca Threptis had rung me. He goes, Tiff, Christine Manfield's going to call you. And at the time, Chrissy had just been awarded Best Restaurant in Australia for Paramount. And I was like, oh, my God. And I'm like, well, literally clutching my trade certificate because I'd just finished. And I thought, oh, this is it. I know everything. I'm ready to go to Sydney. And so Chris rang me, and I was, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And, oh, yeah, that's fine. Yep, no worries. And I organised to sort of move up and go and work at Paramount. And I think I lasted about 3 months, and, oh, boy, was it a culture shock. Oh, my God. It was just for a little girl from Adelaide who thought she knew how to cook, I knew nothing. nothing, and I spent 3 months in the kitchen and, with some very, very extremely talented people, and Chris herself, obviously, and Margie. And I just realised that I wasn't quite cut out for it yet. I wasn't ready for that sort of big step. So I ended up, after 3 months, I resigned. And I do regret it, because I would have kept doing great things with Chris if I had stuck it out. But I just wasn't mature enough, I don't think, to sort of be at that level. And I ended up leaving there, and I did a bit of travelling in Thailand. I was like, maybe I should quit cooking. Maybe I'm not good enough. I had all those doubts as a young female chef, and I was like, no, I think I'm going to do it. And I came back from Thailand after a bit of a holiday, and my housemate was like, hey, we're going to go to brunch. And he took me up to Agostini's, which isn't there anymore, in Wallara. And Margie Agostini came over. She goes, oh, so I hear you want to quit cooking. And I was like, what? How do you know? So my friend was working there as a waiter at the time. And he'd given her the brief of, this young girl that wants to quit, and you need to drag her out of this humdrum and make her realise she's a good young chef, sort of thing. So Margie basically said, you can start next Saturday. And I was like, what do you mean? No, I didn't come here for a job. And she's like, well, you've got one, so you need to turn up next Saturday. So I turned up, and I did probably about 9 months in Sydney at Agostini's, and I absolutely loved it. Like, Margie was, as a boss and as a host and as a business person, she was just such a warm, generous woman. And I ended up going back to work for Margie 3 times over. So I ended up leaving Sydney because my partner at the time was in the army. So we got relocated to Darwin, which was a culinary eye-opener, to say the least. Yeah, so that was a very interesting stint. I sort of flitted around and did a bit of temp work, and then ended up back in Adelaide, where I started working for Maggie the first time.
You spent a little bit of time early on in your career in Adelaide after sort of earning your stripes, as you mentioned. Do you have any stories of what it was like working with Maggie at Pheasant Farm?
Oh, I loved it. Maggie is, like people see her on TV, she's a very generous, warm woman, and she will give anyone all the knowledge of food that will listen. She really does impart a deep understanding of produce in you as a young chef, and also teaches you to think and question, which I think at the time there was a generation of sort of chefs that were told to shut up and do, not to taste and think. So Maggie was kind of pushing against the grain at the time, where she was like, put it in your mouth, chew it, think about it, tell me what you think honestly, like what do you get, and she was always quite open back then to listening to the other chefs that worked with her, having input into the menus, because I was working at Charlick's at the time as sous chef, and I was working under a fellow, John Gable. John's still down at Carrick Hill down in Adelaide as a chef, and John had worked with Maggie for many years as well. And I just learnt so much about the appreciation of produce, how to look after it, respect it, and that real sort of sense of cooking from scratch and how important it is.
When did you first sort of make that move with your career into the pastry area?
So I think I'd been cooking for probably 10 years or so, and at the time I had left working for Maggie. I'd gone and done a little head chef stint in a very small pub in Adelaide, and that was like my first taste of real power in the kitchen. I got to run a kitchen. And I then went on to open a very small wine bar. Oh, God, I can't think of the name. Jazz Bistro or something it was called. And it only lasted 6 months. The owners went under, so we all sort of got locked out. But at the time after we got locked out, I had been on the wait list for the pastry course at Regency, which is a very revered course. Like, they only take 14 students every 6 months, so it's very hard to get into. And I'd been on the wait list for probably about a year, because when I had left working for Maggie and I was at the pub, I sort of realised that one of the biggest gaps in my training was that I didn't know much pastry. And as a head chef, I was sort of like, I can do this, and I can cook lamb and fillet a fish and, break down a pig and whatever, but I can't, my pastry skills are not very strong. So I always wanted to round out my skills if I was going to keep running restaurants. So I got accepted into the pastry course, and that was a 6-month full-time course, which then took me up to Certificate 4. And then I think we had to do like 2 years sort of industry working in the industry as a pastry chef afterwards. But as it happened, I was still working for Maggie the whole time. Like, I went back to work for Maggie and for Saskia, Barossa Farm Produce, while I was studying. So I was doing things on the weekends with Maggie and that. And then I'd finished that course and I was doing some bits and pieces with Maggie and Sass. And I was sort of like, oh, God, what's next? And my partner at the time was a chef as well. And these ads turned up in the Adelaide Advertiser in the newspaper looking for chefs in London. And I said to him, we're just sitting at a cafe one day and I'm like, oh, we should apply for this. Like, you just never know. And it was for a new hotel opening. Little did I know at the time what an important step this was going to be in my career. And I said, we should apply. And he's like, oh, no, we won't even get a look in. I'm like, but we should try. So here's me, and I go home and I do up these resumes and I email them off and we get a response. So we ended up having a couple of phone interviews with the sous chef and the head chef over in London before the hotel had opened. And they're like, okay, great. My partner had a British passport. I applied for sponsorship. The hotel applied for my sponsorship, so I thought. And we were told to get on the plane and be there within 30 days. Okay, that's fine. So we pack our lives up and off we go. So here I am going, yep, sweet, my paperwork's going to be at the airport. And I get to the airport and I get to immigration and they're like, where's your visa? Where's your work permit? And I said, oh, the hotel said it was going to be here waiting for me. And there was someone from the hotel waiting to pick us up, but he had no paperwork. So immigration looked into it and they said, oh, they've only just submitted the application. It's going to be 6 weeks. And I was like, oh, God. So what happened, the hotel said to my partner, look, if you stay here, we'll promote you. And then Tiff, if you come back, we'll promote you too. So I got deported after all of that because I couldn't, for some reason, they just couldn't sort the paperwork out and they thought it was going to be better off sorted out from Sydney. So I get deported and I land back in Sydney and sleep on a friend's couch for 3 months and I go back to work for Margie. So Margie took me in immediately. She's like, yep, I've got lots of hours for you. I'll keep you busy. I'll help you with the paperwork. So, 3 or 4 months later, I think it actually took about 4 months in the end. I'm finally got my sponsorship. I've got all the right paperwork and I get back on the plane to London. So it was, but I went back to a promotion and, all these other things and it was quite the eye-opener. But we ended up, so we were working at the Grove Hotel in Rickmansworth, which is a beautiful hotel. And at the time, being young chefs from Australia, I don't think we quite realised the enormity of what we were doing being a part of the opening team. And it was we spent 3 years there and it was absolutely incredible. And I've met people that I'm still friends with today and, chefs and, front of house alike that have all gone back all over the world. And whenever I sort of go overseas, I try and catch up with different people. But it really was an amazing grounding for our cooking skills for both of us. So from there, I'm just trying to think, where were we? London. Oh, so right before I left for London, I had finished my pastry. So when I went over there, I was actually in the pastry section and I was running pastry and larder. And at the time, the restaurant had 3 rosettes and we were working under a Michelin-starred chef, Chris Harrod. So Chris was from the Le Manoir stables, working for Romain Blanc. And it was funny because when we were headed back to Sydney after our 3 years, Chris said, look these guys up, Justin North and Colin Fastnich. He goes, I worked with these guys at Le Manoir. So here we are, we're clutching these phone numbers. That Chris is like, I think this is still their numbers or whatever. Anyway, so we come back and then we ended up getting in touch with Justin, and my partner went to work for Justin. And at the time, Darren Vaughan was opening Sydney Tower, which went belly up pretty fast. So I ended up going to work for Darren very briefly, and then I resigned quite quickly, realising it wasn't the right fit working with the Truffle Group at the time. And then as it happened, Justin passed my number on to Colin, and Colin was looking for a sous chef because he'd just taken over the 4 in hand. So I turn up, I have a chat with Colin, and he's like, what have you been doing? I said, oh, this and this and this over in London. And, he's like, okay, great, and then we sort of left it there. And I was waiting for him to call me to say, yes, you've got the job, or when can you start? And then he was waiting for me to call him. So I nearly didn't get the job. So eventually I followed him up and he goes, oh, I thought you would have called sooner. And I said, I was waiting for you. Anyway, so he's like, oh, when can you start? So I started, and that was sort of the beginning of the relationship with Colin and with the Four in Hand. So I started, and I think 5 weeks later he got married. He went and got married to Jane. So I was left in charge literally 5 weeks after opening, which again, another baptism of fire, like no pressure. We're going, we're trying to build our way up to our first hat and whatever. And he leaves me alone to run the kitchen. So, and we were fine. We survived. And then the first year at the Four in Hand, we didn't get the hat. And I remember there was a standoff for about, I want to say 3 or 4 days between me and Colin, where Colin just didn't speak to me. Like, what have you done wrong? What have you done when I wasn't here? I could feel the penetrating gazes of, what happened when I wasn't around to make us not get the hat. Anyway, the review came out, and it came down to the service at the time, and a particularly jumped up waiter who I think had too many exciting nights before, and at the time when the reviewers came in, the service just wasn't where it should have been. So yeah, a bit of a deep breath, and then Colin all of a sudden starts talking to me again when he realises it wasn't his sous chef that let him down. And then the following year we got the hat, and then the pressure was on the year after, to get the second hat. And so the whole time I was there, I think he didn't get the second hat until after I'd left. I think Carla Jones was his sous chef when he got the second hat. But those 3 years were, again, amazing, like just learning that nose to tail cooking, dining, eating, and just the appreciation of produce, again, really came through working for Colin. And, it was a tough kitchen, and I ran it when he wasn't there with amazing confidence. And, I believe he really did appreciate my time there. I've got his first hat, Huck, actually. He signed it for me when I left. And I remember a few years back he was lining all his hats up or something. And I'm like, still got the first one. So, yeah.
You spent some time working with Justin North as well in the pastry section and running pastry sections. Do you have any stories of what that was like?
Again, really interesting time in my career. So after I left Colin, I took 6 months off and I went around the world. I'd sold a property, so I thought this is the only chance I'm going to get to really travel and eat and spend all the money. So I went all over the place and landed back. And right before we left, so my partner at the time was working for Justin. And right before we left, Justin sort of said, oh, what are you going to do when you get back? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, do you want to come and work in the pastry? Because he knew that I'd been trained in pastry. He said, we need someone between pastry and larder. And I said, that's fine. I'll come and do that until I decide what I want to do. And when we came back, they had then sort of laid down the foundation for the opening of Etch, which used to be on the ground floor of the Intercontinental. And so Justin sort of proposed to me, look, spend 6 months at Baccass in Clarence Street, and then once Etch opens, you can move across there as head pastry chef. And I thought, oh, this would be amazing. So the time at Baccass was very interesting. Again, some relationships have been formed there that are lifelong relationships with people that I worked with. I got to work with the very lovely Jacqueline Kaludrovic, and me and Jackie formed a really good foundation, for our friendship. I still get texts from her from over in LA asking questions and throwing ideas back and forth about pastry. And, that sort of relationship with a lot of those boys too, and some of them who were only apprentices then who are now running their own kitchens, like Anthony Skiff, and Paul. Actually, no, Paul was at the Four in Hand, sorry, not Baccass. But, watching Anthony, he was a little apprentice then, and the trouble he used to get into with Justin. And now he's, leaps and bounds, got 3 hats and doing his own thing. It's really quite incredible to sort of look back and realise the relationships that were formed.
You've done so many things since then, from catering to sort of Lotus Dining Group and run your own businesses as well. But you also worked with Channel 7. Tell us about how that came about and what that was like.
So I did, I was what they call home economist for Zumbo's Just Dessert Season 2, which did air on Netflix, and then I think it aired on Channel 7 later on. So that came about. So Jackie's cousin, Kate Nichols. Kate works in television. She used to be a chef. So she's a food producer and she works on a lot of these shows. And they needed someone who had the technical experience in pastry. sort of work between Adriano and the producers. So Adriano and his chefs would put the recipes together and then they'd send them to me, and then I would test them in a similar environment to what the contestants would be working in, and then I'd have to kind of pare them down. So say a 20-page recipe had to get into a 4-hour filming parameter without upsetting Adriano, but also keeping the producers happy. So it was a very interesting role. Hard work. TV in the back end is any TV is hard work. But really, really hard work. And it was, but it was so much fun. It was really interesting watching all the contestants, kind of learn and grow as they went through the show, and to watch them all come out and find their own feet, in the different parts of the industry as well has been really interesting. It actually brings me to my next instalment of what I'm up to. I'm actually going to do the Great Australian Bake Off. Starts at the end of this month. So I'm going to be the technical chef, to do similar role to what I did on Zumbo. And I'm very excited to work with all the guys, Darren Purchase, who I met when I was judging a pastry competition a couple of years back, and, Rachel Koo, who was also the host on Zumbo, and then a lot of the food team I already know. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting 10 weeks, but that's for season 7. Yeah, season 7. So
I briefly mentioned sort of Lotus Dining Group. Tell us a bit about that, because it was such a big role over so many venues, but delving into the world of Asian restaurants. What was that like for you in regards to desserts and the skill set that you had?
So Lotus was, it was very interesting. It was an interesting time because a lot of Asian restaurants don't have trailblazing desserts. And at the time when I went into Lotus, I got asked to come and actually start consulting. Tara Sullivan was the GM at the time, and I'd known Tara from back in the Etch and Bacass days. And she kind of had this vision of having a more modern, really kind of cutting edge dining experience with high-end, Chinese cuisine. And as you know, Lotus's dishes are all fairly high-end as it is. But what they were missing was really having that good end experience with dessert. So I had come in to consult, and then I went off to actually do the Gelato World Cup, and then I came back, and this is after we'd come third in Australia. So Lotus were really stoked. They're like, oh, well, we've got this champion person, and I didn't really think about it at the time. So I came in, and there was nothing when I started. They didn't even have a pastry section. So Michael Zhang, he's the owner of Lotus Dining, he said, Tiff, we've got this spot over here in the middle of the restaurant. We're going to build it out, and we're going to build a little pastry bar. And I went, amazing. So we did that. We designed it. We got it built. Took, 4 or 5 months. So I basically just worked off some temporary cabinets for the first few months while I was testing to get the recipes going. And that was at the Galleries, was the first kitchen. And then, so at the time, I think they only had the Galleries. They had Walsh Bay, and we were in the midst of opening Barangaroo. So we sort of started off with a couple of restaurants, and initially the supply was Galleries, and then as I built up my team and the kitchen sort of got built to being a bit bigger, we started supplying Dumpling Bar, with things like we did some branded, ice creams, and we did petit fours and stuff, things that were quick because they have a real theatre crowd over there. And then for the Galleries was really those beautiful high-end desserts, working with a lot of the Asian flavours, which I found quite refreshing, actually, quite enjoyable, because it gave me like this whole other playbook of different flavours to sort of work into that classic technique of pastry that had a lot of French grounding. So I really did do some interesting things there, and I really, really loved it. Taking the moulded kind of fruit desserts were taking off at the time. When I was in Italy was when I seen it, when I was competing, and when I came back, I came up with the idea of doing the mandarin picked from the tree, which was, I think it was in sync for Chinese New Year that we ended up launching it. And at the same time, Cedric Grillet, who's super, super famous pastry chef, had come out, had started doing fruit desserts as well. So I don't know. Nothing's really original idea, is it? It's all, we all get inspiration from somewhere. But whether we were doing it on opposite sides of the world at the same time, I don't know. So we started with the mandarin, and then later on, as time went on, I sort of started thinking about, my early days of working with food, eating on the farm, and one of the things that I kept coming back to was the passion fruit. So my mum on the farm always had passion fruit vines for pavlovas. And I would spend the summer bored on school holidays eating my way through the passion fruit vine to the point where Mum would come out and be like, how's there no passion fruits? and there'd just be a pile of skins on the ground because I'd been sitting there in the sun with a spoon, just scooping out all the passion fruits, throwing the skins away, not telling Mum what I was doing, and always getting in trouble for eating all the passion fruits. So I then designed a dessert called the passion fruit pick from the vine, and I made my own mould, and I got some nice wrinkly passion fruits, and we, in the true style of trying to, recycle and not waste anything, I did a glaze made from the passion fruit skins. So it had this deep purple colour, and, passion fruit ice cream in the middle, a little bit of passion fruit cooling and some marshmallow. So it was quite a cracking dessert, and it made, the Herald and the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age on the same day, so of what's hot right now. So I was pretty happy about that. And then when I sent the article, I sent it to Mum, like, look, Mum, I can make passion fruits now. I don't have to eat yours. So I'm pretty sure she's got that on the wall somewhere at home. But it was really exciting times. And then there was other reiterations that came on. I did the bamboo as well, which was a real kind of flagship dessert for Lotus. And then when I got to work with Valrhona Chocolate, and because the company was so big and we were using such volume, I really formed a good relationship with Valrhona that I still have today. And I get massive support from them from overseas and from here in Australia, using their chocolate, and they share sort of my little works all the time. Even now when I'm only doing sort of small things, they still give me massive support. So, which as a pastry chef is great. It's always nice to have a brand like that behind you.
At the top of the show, you sort of detailed sort of the triumph that you've had over the extreme adversities over the last couple of years. How much has it changed you, and what do you love about what you do now?
It's definitely changed me in the sense that I feel a bit more relaxed about things. I'm learning to kind of take a step back and really only take on what resonates with me. I'm not taking on jobs just to earn. I mean, we all need to earn money, don't get me wrong, and we've all got rent to pay, and me probably more so than a lot of people. But I'm trying to sort of, I guess, sort through the noise per se, and really just align myself with things that truly bring my creativity out, that I can relax and enjoy doing again. And it's just given me the ability to slow down a bit, Huck. Like I feel like I've spent 30 years on a hamster wheel, running. And this year's kind of, I became quite unwell at the start. I had pneumonia for 8 weeks. And if that's not your body's way of saying you need to stop and lay down, I don't know what is. And it made me stop and lay down and, have a really, really big breather and a really good hard look at, that balance, that, making sure you look after yourself so you can keep creating and you can keep putting beautiful things out in the world. And looking back, like I said, it has made me realise what a strong person I am mentally and also physically. I don't know how I pushed myself through it sometimes. But when you really want something badly enough, you do. You try to push through it as much as you can. And that resilience really, really came through for me. And that's what's made me kind of, I guess, stop, dust myself off and keep going. And I really do. I love what I do. I love the creativity. I love taking something raw like a bunch of rhubarb and turning it into something incredible where people are like, oh, my God, wow, from, a few basic ingredients. And it is really something magical to be able to do that in life and to feed people,
Well, Tiffany, I know you've got so many more stories and you're an absolute inspiration, and I can't wait to see what comes for the rest of the year. We've loved having you on Deep in the Weeds today. Please keep in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, definitely.
And we'll have to catch up again soon.
Yep, no worries. I appreciate your time. Thanks, Huck. Take care.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.